Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today. Give me the chance to speak to everybody. The title of the presentation is Renewable Energy and Generation. I'm going to talk about that, but about energy in Michigan in general, regionally, renewable standards, clean energy standards, kind of what is going on in the state and how that impacts us on a local level. So as mentioned, there's my name and title. Some of the things we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to start with some basic definitions that I'll use throughout the presentation so we kind of can level set on some terms. I'm going to talk about the grid. We hear that term a lot, the grid. What is it? Who runs it? Who's responsible for it? Kind of, we'll give a high level overview of that. We'll get into what is happening regionally with renewable generation. Where do we think we're going? What's it going to look like in 20 years from now, in 10 years from now? Kind of where we're at and where we think we're going. Based on state of Michigan mandates, what's happening in the state, what are changes to state law, how does that drive what utilities like Alpena Power and other utilities do? And then we'll get into a little more details in Michigan. How does that affect utilities in Michigan? We'll talk a little bit about DT and consumers. They cover over 90% of the residents of Michigan as the two largest utilities. Kind of talk briefly about their plans and then get down to a local level, what's going to happen around Alpena in our region. So I like to do informal presentations. If there's questions as I go through, if what I'm saying isn't making sense or you have a question, clarification, feel free to speak up as we go through. Okay? So a few definitions. I'll talk about some electrical kilowatt. A lot of people may be familiar with that, 1,000 watts. Okay, it's a measure of electrical energy or electrical power. A kilowatt can handle a small space heater, maybe your microwave, that kind of scale, kilowatt scale. The next level, megawatt, 1,000 kilowatts. You know, we talk about renewable generation, they get into megawatt scale, okay? Gigawatt, the next level, 1 billion watts. We start talking about regionally energy needs, power generation on a regional level, we'll talk in the gigawatt scale. And then kilowatt hour, simply put, kilowatt is a instantaneous number. I equate it to, I'm driving my truck. I might be going 60 miles an hour at any given point. Okay, that's the speed I'm going. If I drive 60 miles an hour for an hour, I'll go 60 miles. Kilowatt hour is equivalent to that mile or that odometer. How long was that energy level there for a period of time? So it's a measure of energy over time. To put it in this perspective or scale, the average house, roughly 500, maybe a little bit more, 500 kilowatt hours a month is the average residential usage. Specific to Alpena is about 535, roughly. We'll talk about renewable energy and what does that mean? What is renewable energy? What qualifies? And that's technically a defined term by state law. So the state of Michigan defines what renewable energy is. I'm summarizing it here. Solar. So solar farms, solar panels, wind generation. You've driven down 127 in the last 5-10 years. You see a lot of those wind turbines all over in that area of the state. Drive out in the Thumb, there's a lot of them out there. Existing hydro. And I put that existing. By state law, new hydro is not renewable. Okay, they're pushing away from developing more hydro, actually going the opposite way, trying to take hydro out, get rivers back to a natural run-of-the-river situation. And some biomass. By putting that some is grandfathered in. New biomass, and by biomass, we think about the plant that was in Lincoln, that is now closed, that burned wood. The plant that was in Hillman is now gone. Those were biomass plants. They burned wood. Some of those plants throughout the state are still grandfathered in and considered renewable. Over time, they will lose that designation. The state is pushing away from anything that burns as being renewable. Okay? Another term I'll talk about, and this is also defined in the recent laws in Michigan, is clean energy, which is clean energy is anything renewable is considered clean. The other way you define clean is anything that does not produce CO2. So think about nuclear. Okay, a lot of people have different opinions on nuclear. By state law, nuclear is considered clean. a clean form of energy because it doesn't produce CO2. Natural gas can be considered clean if you capture the carbon. So I don't know if anybody's heard of that technology or things in the news. We've tried it at a few spots in the US, marginally successfully, where you actually burn something like natural gas, which puts out CO2. You capture the CO2, you liquefy it, and you put it underground for long-term storage so it doesn't get into the atmosphere.
So it's not gone.
It's underground. So that is considered by state law clean. Okay, so those are definitions that are included in the recent legislation that was passed in 2023 in the state of Michigan, those definitions. And later we'll talk a little bit more why it's important and how does it play into what utilities do. Okay? Questions before I move on? All right. I want to talk now about the grid a little bit. We hear that term a lot, so I get questions, well, who runs the grid? Answer to that, there's many people that overall run the grid, that are involved in running the grid. But there's an entity called MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. They are an entity that's responsible to run the grid in these regions of the country. This covers most of the central United States, goes from Louisiana up through Michigan. Actually, it extends into Canada. This just shows the US portion. It does cover parts of Canada. They are responsible for the overall function of the grid in this region. Okay. The other thing that's important is there's several different colors on that map with numbers. Those are different regions within MISO's footprint. Okay, they call them resource zones. A lot of them are defined based on what was there for electrical systems. The systems kind of operate as they are interconnected, but they operate almost as little islands. So if you look at Michigan, you look at the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, most of it is one resource zone. A lot of that has to do with geography and the lakes around it. You don't run power lines across the lake very easily or through the lake very easily. Okay, so those different regions are set up based on what was there for infrastructure. Inside those regions, the system runs pretty seamlessly. Moving energy in and out of regions is more difficult. It has to do with just the physical configuration, things like mountains, lakes, rivers, but that's kind of how those are broken up. And so MISO treats each region independently when you get into pricing and rules and things like that. Yes, sir.
Chicago and Southwest Michigan, they're its own little generating system there?
They are actually part of a different system operator that runs out of the East Coast, called PJM. Why they ended up that way, I don't know, but they are, and they are separate. They are separate from the rest of the MISO footprint. Yes, sir.
Do they exchange any kind of power at any time?
You can on a limited basis. So there is ways to import energy in and between zones, but typically it's limited by the size of the wires, the amount of interconnections. Okay, it's difficult to move power that far because of all the obstacles in between.
Well, why are we
Because that's the regional footprint that MISO has, and the entire country is divided up into different entities. That's what was, when they were formed, that's what was decided, who operates it. So what is MISO's role? What do they do? One of their main objectives is to ensure electrical supply can meet demand. So in an electrical system, when you generate electricity, it is almost always instantaneously consumed. Supply and demand always have to balance. Now there's things like batteries that have the ability to change energy and store it. That's becoming more prevalent in the market. But on a daily basis, a vast majority of the energy that we consume is generated at that same instant. So when somebody from a small scale turns on a light switch or adds demand or adds load to the system, somewhere connected to the grid, a generator recognizes that and puts out its output, increases its output so they match. And that happens continuously. So demand and supply have to meet. They do that. Their main leverage to do that is through wholesale markets. And they do that by price signals. So and it goes back to the supply demand, back from basic economics. Supply is high and demand is low. What happens to pricing? It drops because supply is in excess of demand. So prices will drop. In these markets, prices can go negative, where you can actually have to pay to generate power if supply is way out of whack with demand, too high. The opposite can occur where demand outpaces supply. And so in those situations, prices go up significantly. So that's how essentially MISO regulates the market to make sure it matches, is through those price signals. So if I'm a generator and supply is low and prices go high, I want to sell when prices are high. So that encourages more generators to get into that market to be able to supply to meet that. If there's too much generation and prices are low or can possibly even go negative, I want to stop generating. And that's how they balance the system. It always has to be balanced. That is a key component as we get into more generation that's intermittent, more solar, more wind, where there's not somebody in control room that can turn it up or turn it down. You're relying on Mother Nature to do that. So it adds an extra challenge. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The other thing they do is manage the changing resource mix. And manage interconnections. So MISO looks at, okay, how much generation is on the grid and is it enough? Do I need more? Do we need less? If something changes from say a coal plant that's very reliable and puts out the same amount all the time to an intermittent resource, what do I have to do to accommodate that? So that is one of their jobs, and one of their main focuses is to make sure that resource mix is there so that the lights stay on at a grand scale, so that, because if the demand and supply gets far enough out of whack, you'll have outages, you'll have brownouts, you'll have blackouts where it can't meet each other. And then the other things, transmission planning and operations, they oversee a lot of the operators of the transmission system. So people, even look at our region. Who's been out Long Rapids Road lately and saw the new substation?
The dam.
The dams are owned by a company called Eagle Creek Renewable Generation.
And they're still generating energy.
They generate energy. Alpena Power buys that energy. Yes.
Been talk at times removing the dam.
There has, and that's so Eagle Creek is governed by FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're the ones that oversee those dams. Whether they get, their licensing, and there's a whole lot that goes into that. But we have a contract with them to buy their energy. For scale, all 4 dams in our area, 9th Street, 4 Mile, Norway, and Hillman. Hillman's also part of our territory. That's about 10% of the energy Alpena Power needs. Comes out of those 4 dams.
Did Alpena Power own those at one time?
Yes, Alpena Power built those. We sold those in right around 1990. So I want to talk a little bit now about resource mix. So what's going on? This is MISO wide. So, go back to that map. This goes from Louisiana up to Michigan, Minnesota. So looking at this chart, the one on the left, this is a snapshot of what was there in 2022. So if you looked at 2022, and I know I'll kind of talk to the colors in case I know some of the words are a little bit fuzzy. Okay, that was the resource mix in MISO in 2022, and it totaled 200 gigawatts. So we're talking about a lot of energy here. 12 gigawatts was nuclear. That's the orange on the bottom. 48 is coal. Your typical coal plants. I think the closest around here would be Bay City. The Carter and Weedock plants owned by consumers. The blue is natural gas. So a vast majority of this, the 48 and the 79 between coal and natural gas, you're talking about fossil fuel generation. All right. Wind, 33, That has grown significantly in the last 10 years, the amount of wind generation out there. Yellow is solar, so 11 gigawatts is solar. And the gray is other. That would be hydro, that would be biomass, geothermal. There's a lot of other small, all those other small portions that kind of total up. So then what MISO's job is, okay, now they're going to look forward over 20 years and say, where's this system, where do I think it's going to be in 20 years? How much energy we need to meet our demand, and where's that going to come from? So the next column over with the 88 gigawatts, that's retirements. That's planned closures. A plant could be obsolete and needs to close. Its license could be up. Its owner could say it's uneconomical, I'm going to close it. Various reasons why those might close. Most of that is coal at 42. Natural gas at 23, 18 of wind, and there's some other minor ones in there. I think a little bit of solar, maybe some other. Those are the retirements. So that's what they know of is going to go off the grid by 2042. The next column is what's going on the grid. Okay, what do we need to meet demand? What additions are going to be made? 23 gigawatts of gas, but most importantly, and the point of the slide, 67 gigawatts of wind and 74 gigawatts of solar. So MISO sees the resource mix changing. Okay. Now I want to be something to clarify. MISO doesn't set policy. They don't say you shall do this, you shall do that. They just say this is what I see based on what companies are doing, what states are doing, what utilities are doing. This is where they see the market, the system going. So a vast majority of the additions are renewable generation, mainly solar and wind. All right. The other one that shows up there, and I want to talk to that a little bit, is in the red, and that's battery storage. Okay. Battery storage going on the grid so that you could take those intermittent resources such as sun, such as wind, store them when you have excess, and discharge them when you need it. So there is a large push, and there's a large push within Michigan to add battery storage to the grid to help smooth out those intermittent sources.
What was like the first one, 48% or like black? Is that coal?
This dark gray here?
Yeah.
Yes, that's coal.
And the light gray is?
The light gray is other. So it might be like it could be a gasification plant. I don't have the details of what they are. Could be hydro, could be biomass. But if you notice, in 2042, there is no straight coal left.
I think a few years back, they were going to put in a coal plant in Boulder City.
That was discussed by Wolverine Power Cooperative, yes. And they decided not to. Yep. So by 2042, within MISO, they're saying there's not going to be a coal plant left. So why is that? What is driving this change? Okay. So by 2042, solar is expected to be the largest generation component out there. That's what's expected, followed by wind. But why is that? Okay. First, decarbonization goals. You see that from companies like you take Ford Motor Company, for example, Walmart, your big, those household names, they may have their own goals. Where Walmart may say, we want all renewable generation. So companies have their own goals for whatever reasons that they decide. Okay, that's part of this. The other part, and what's more important to me as a operating utility, is legislative mandates. So back at the end of 2023, Governor Whitner signed a series of laws. I think there was 6 or 7 laws that were signed that revamp energy policy in Michigan and shape it for the next 20 years. The main one was called Public Act 235, and it increased renewable energy requirements. So currently, under existing state law, that was in effect before this, every utility had to have 15% of their generation come from renewable. So Alpena Power, we bought renewable generation to cover 15% of our load. That was state law. That was in effect. Okay. That continues through 2029. In 2030, that jumps to 50%. So by 2030, Alpena Power, DTE, consumers, every utility in the state has to have 50% of their generation come from renewable. So we have to transition where we get our energy from the existing sources to renewable. Yes, sir. What are the consequences if I don't? That's a good question. Because the law really doesn't define what it is. In the end, they could basically they could take away Alpena's license and a license to operate. You know, like we have regulators. We have regulators come out on Lansing. If I say I'm not following your regulation, I'm not doing what you do, okay, they can go after us and actually take away our ability to be a utility. Okay. Yes, sir.
Would be given all the plan, produce enough energy for the electric vehicles that evidently are going to be rammed down everybody's throat.
MISO says yes, but MISO also says we better start building a heck of a lot faster than we are now. And actually, the electric vehicles is part of it. And I don't want to minimize that. But the other thing that's very large and coming down utilities is data centers. Everybody's heard of AI. It takes an enormous amount of energy to run AI.
Different, don't know, we get a different governor.
Yes, the legislature and the governor of Michigan have the ability to change law. They could throw the whole thing out. You know, they have the ability to modify state law just like they do on anything else. Okay, but it would take the legislature and the governor to make those changes. Okay, so going back to your question about is there enough? There can be. Is this, can you build it fast enough? Okay. The other thing that goes along with building it and talking about building renewable generation is land use. Okay. One of the other bills of those 6 or 7 that were passed in 2023 has to do with it was a renewable siting law. So under the previous set of rules, local townships, local jurisdictions had authority over their zoning. The new state law says that if a township, I think some of you know where I'm going with this, says we're going to zone out so you can't put solar in this township. Well, the state can override that by state law. Whether that has never been used, they're getting sued right now by, I think, the Township Association in Michigan. So that would end up, obviously, my opinion, would end up in courts, whether they could do that. You know, who knows what will come out of that. But it's to be able to stop local, just being blunt with everybody, so local units of government can't stop state mandates, is what that comes down to. So think about Rogers City. Everybody's, you know, the South Rogers City, Southern Presque Isle County, there's a large solar farm being put in there. And that's being put in by DTE. Now that was approved through their normal zoning. There's a lot of opinions about that land use. Okay. I'll give you my opinion as well, but I'm talking more about state law, what can be done. So say that were to happen again and that township said, no, that's not allowed, it doesn't meet our zoning. That developer could go to the state and say, this is to help meet state mandates. I want the state to override local zoning. And the way the law is written, they can do that.
Well, the land is leased for X number of years, isn't it?
Correct.
What's gonna happen at the end of X number of years?
From the lease, that specific one, I don't know, it's all contained in the lease. I've looked at some of these leases for other entities. And there's other entities that try to put solar in our footprint. they contain the return to normal provisions. So they have to take it out and return it back to normal. That's
That would be project.
correct. The thing I would be concerned with, and this would be, okay, this is my own opinion, not the company's opinion, but if I sign one of those leases, well, what if that entity's not around anymore? Then what good is it? So there's ways to protect yourself in a lease, with bonding and things like that. So if somebody went away, but could you completely return it? I don't know. But that's what's in a lot of those leases.
You might not want to renew them too.
Correct.
I mean, I've been up there and looked at that.
Mhm.
I mean, as far as you can see, that's all you see is solar panels.
Yep. And it just, I look at it, there's also two sides to that. Okay. If I wanted to lease my land, can my neighbor tell me I can't? That's another argument. I'm not arguing one way or the other, but those are the discussions we hear about when you get into these lease agreements and renewable generation. Well, if I'm a farmer and I want to retire and they're going to pay me $1,000 an acre for the next 40 years, might sound okay. So that's when you get, that's where these zoning laws, and this is going to come, because of the scale of what's happening in the state. I'll talk a little bit about that scale here in a second, how much more of this is going to have to come to meet these requirements. How much more is going to have to get built, okay? The other part of the law is, so it goes to 50% in 2030, by 2035 it's 60%. And that stays 60% annually from there forever until the law is changed. So every utility in the state will have to have, by 2035, 60% of their generation come from renewable, which is going to be essentially solar, wind, or existing hydros, which is a pretty small portion in Michigan. We got a lot of water, but it's pretty flat. There's not a lot of large scale hydro in Michigan. The other part of that is what they call the clean energy requirement. So by 2035, 80% of what we sell has to be clean. So of that 80%, 60 of it has to be renewable. That other 20% could be additional renewable, or it could be what they consider clean, which is, according to state law, is nuclear or gas with carbon capture. Those are essentially your two options. So that's where the state is pushing utilities for that future resource mix. 2035 may sound a ways away. Building stuff like this, building a nuclear plant, you'd be lucky to do it in 10 or 15 years. The last one that was built in the US was in South Carolina. I think that took like 18 years to build. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That never opened back up.
I don't believe so. And then you have the Palisades plant, which is, I think, South Haven area on Lake Michigan, which was closed, and they're in the process of trying to recommission that to get that turned back on and be able to produce on the grid.
All this, how much effect are we having on global warming when China and India, what the pollution that they're creating, how much of an effect are we going to have on it?
I don't have an answer to that. That's a great question. A lot of people have different opinions on that. And what's the true effect of all this stuff? All right. From our perspective, we have to comply with state law from a business perspective. So that's where we're going. So that's the mandates out there. So what does that mean? What's going to have to happen? So part of that law says, okay, to comply with this, each utility has to file what's called a renewable energy plan. You have to tell the state, I have to tell the state, how am I going to comply with the law? Okay, so the first two plans that have to get filed were by the two large utilities. DT Electric, which covers basically the thumb in southeast Michigan, and Consumers, which covers a good portion of the rest of the Lower Peninsula. including your major population centers such as Lansing, Grand Rapids, those areas. Okay, and those two utilities cover over 90% of the residents of Michigan. What DTE has said is that by 2042, they're going to have, and this is a very specific numbers, but over 10,000 megawatts of wind generation on their system and almost 10,000 megawatts of solar generation. And from today, what they have, that's an increase, a total increase of over 16,000 megawatts. So to put that in a little bit of perspective, the plant in Rogers City, I know somebody said how large it seems to be, that is roughly a 100 megawatt plant. So for just DTE, they would need another 162 of those to meet this. Okay? In 20 years, that's what they say they're going to be in 20 years. That's just DTE. Consumer says they're going to add another 8,000 megawatts of solar, which would be 80 of those, and another 2.8 gigawatts of wind. When you do the math, that's the generation it's going to take to meet those mandates. Okay, which is why that's there. So these two plans are in front of the Public Service Commission in Michigan for approval right now. Okay? So you think about the scale of how much of this, and a vast majority of this will be built in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Has to be built in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And so you talk about, land use, solar is roughly 5 acres a megawatt. So you think about the amount of acreage that's going to take and where's that going to go. Okay? But to meet the state law, that's what needs to be built by those two utilities. I saw something in the news about that as well. The other thing that drives a lot of this stuff is tax breaks, government incentives. Okay, there's large tax credits for building renewable. Do those stay? Without those tax credits, okay, the solar plant, the solar farm costs so many dollars to build. Those tax credits, be 30, 40%, are a large portion of that. If that goes away, where does that money come from? So there's a lot of change, you talk about changes in administration, changes in law, makes my job a little bit more difficult because how things change. Different administrations change things.
Generation seems to be causing a lot of problems with what lives in it. Whales beaching and everything else.
Yes, sir.
How about generation on your own home or your own factory? Is that figured in?
That is figured into the law. We forecast how much of that there will be, because there's some of that on our system. DTE consumers, they all have had on that system. In these plans, you get into the details, we forecast how much of that we think is going to be there. And that is included in that. This is in addition to that behind the meter generation. So I guess just for perspective, there are some of that in Alpena. It's roughly, we're at about 0.3% of our usage comes from behind the meter generation. That's the solar on somebody's garage or in their backyard or around their house. One of the strategies is for that land use is to disperse this. There's a trade-off though. And that trade-off comes from scale. Me putting 10 kilowatts of solar on my garage is going to cost a certain amount of money. Okay? Doing things at a larger scale, on a utility scale, you can bring that cost per kW down. So there's a trade-off there. Where you put it. Because you do a lot of small projects, overall they become more costly on a per kilowatt basis than a utility scale, but you have less issues with land use, things like that. So what is Alpena doing? So what is our plan? So, and I filed this in January. Last month, we filed our plan. Alpena Power, we're a little bit different than most utilities in the state. One, because of our size. We're one of the smallest in the state. But we don't own any generation. So every kilowatt hour that gets sold by us to our consumers, our customers, we bought. And we buy those from various sources. We buy them from the dams on the system. Most of it comes off just market-based energy off the grid. Okay, we buy it at wholesale prices. Okay, so we don't own any generation. Our plan is to do more of that for renewable. So for example, our intention is to put out for bids. Alpena needs so much renewable generation to meet the law. From all the sources that are available, what can I get that most economically from? And there's a couple reasons for that. One is economies of scale. Okay, Alpena Power, we could build a solar plant in this, in our footprint. We could do that. It'll cost so much per kilowatt because of its size. If I buy a piece of a larger one somewhere else in the state, that cost will likely be lower. So that's one of the reasons to put it out, to open up more options, to see, to get the economies of scale. The other part of that is it's not cheap to build. And being able to spread that cost over a longer period will have less impact to customers. So those are the two main reasons why our strategy is what it is. Okay. Time will tell how successful those RFPs are. One of the questions I get a lot is, well, how much is it going to cost me? What is going to be the cost of this law? And I try not to get into politics too much, but there is very vastly different estimates of what this is going to cost. One side says this is going to save you all money. Your power bill is going to go down. Another perspective says your power bill will likely double. Usually the truth is in between somewhere, but it's very perspective driven on what this will actually cost. Okay. I don't know the answer to that. I look at it this way though. This is going to require us to build a heck of a lot of stuff. There's a lot of land that's got to get used. There's a lot of stuff that has to get built, a lot of parts that have to get bought. That all costs money. None of that's free. How that offsets costs that are going away is to be determined. We'll see. We'll see the impact of this. This is driven by the people. The legislature, who we all elected, whether you voted for them or not, but we voted for somebody, enacted these laws. Okay? So we as citizens have the ability to help influence that. And time will tell what the true impact is of this. My strategy, Alpena Power strategy, is to take it as slow as we can, to be honest with you. The first one through the wall is usually the bloodiest, and I don't want to be that one. I'd rather go through the hole somebody else puts through. So, go ahead.
Discussion of conservation, like I started using convection. That's phenomenal, because it doesn't generate heat. Yeah, convection, it's electromagnetic. And also my house is 2x6 construction. I use 500, it's almost 2,000 square feet. I use 500 gallons of propane. My neighbor's equivalent, they use 3 times that. So I think somewhere in here, people have to look at changes for conservation.
And I didn't cover it in this because there's a lot to all this law. There's also energy waste reduction measures that have to be taken. So that our programs, and those programs are in place now. What's happening with them though is the annual requirement of how much we're saving needs to go up. So if anybody looks at their bill, there is there's a little surcharge hidden in there that helps fund those energy waste reduction measures. And there is an increased focus on that from the state level. Right now, the law is 1%. That's going to go up to 2% on an annual basis. But we look at those conservation efforts. But when MISO and utilities look at, well, what is the grid going to need, that's incorporated, but what about all the other things that are getting added to it? Because on the electric grid, there's a lot of things that are getting pushed to the electric grid from other sources. A lot of electrification of transportation. Somebody mentioned electric vehicles. That'll add strain to the electric grid. Electrification of heat, there's much more, there's more focus on heat pumps, geothermal systems versus, standard furnaces. All of that gets incorporated into those forecasts to what is going to be needed from the electric grid. And there definitely is a trade-off between, natural gas, electric. You can lower your usage by getting rid of my natural gas furnace, but add a heat pump. Well, I use less natural gas, but I use more electricity. So a lot of that is considered and covered under the law. Yes.
The question I had was the part where you buy wholesale and then resell it to your customers. Is it just as easy to buy from consumers as it is the DTE? Are you hooked up to both, or do you have a favorite?
So we hook up to the grid. So we have different contracts with different utilities to buy energy. Most of our stuff comes from the grid, which doesn't have a specific source. And it's kind of an abstract thing to say, but electricity is a commodity. So there's lots of sellers selling into the grid on any one time. And there's lots of people buying off the grid at any one time. And MISO helps set those prices based on supply and demand. So we don't necessarily have a source that energy comes from. It's more of just a commodity.
You pay into it, like so, who was putting in it at the time?
Correct. Everybody's metered in and out, and so they set pricing, and then what prices are set by that. That's one way we buy energy. We also we buy blocks of energy to say it's a fixed price because the energy markets go up and down. I don't want to be fully exposed to that risk. So we hedge a good portion of it at a price. You pay a little premium, but then that price is fixed. To give you an example, who remembers it happened in Texas probably 2 or 3 years ago, that big winter storm that they had. And there was a lot of things in the news about how people were getting enormous electric bills. Okay. If I buy market energy all the time, 100%, over the long run, the price is lower because I own the risk. I'm taking on that risk. But there are times in those extreme events where instead of paying 22 cents a kilowatt, now I'm paying $1,000 a kilowatt. And I'm exposed to that. So we try to manage that by hedging for certain things, but I don't buy from a specific generator. We buy from Alpena Power buys from the market. Yes.
Question. Is there really a grid? Can I go out some farmer's field and see this grid that is electrical current or something?
The grid is all the wires and poles you see everywhere we go, to be honest with you. It is all of that. That is all interconnected. Yep. From the ones that radiate out here on Johnson Street, out in front of the college, that is connected to the grid. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure. So how this works, and on a basic scale. So most of us are familiar with like a gas engine, like in a car or a lawnmower or something like that. Okay. If you say I'm mowing my lawn and I hit a bunch of real tall grass, what'll happen to it? It'll bog down and it'll slow down. What happens to electrical generators? Because most of them are massive spinning pieces of steel. That additional load will slow them down. Okay. How my lawnmower handles that is it has a governor that says, hey, I'm going too slow. I need more fuel. and it'll open up fuel to speed itself back up. The grid works the same way. So I don't know if anybody's, I'm trying not to get too far into the weeds, but it operates at a certain 60 hertz. Has anybody heard that term? The North American grid runs at 60 hertz. It's 8 cycles per second. You overload the grid, that'll slow down. And it'll slow down minutes, to 59.9, say. That's a signal to generators out there, and MISO looks at that, generators look at that to say, hey, I need more fuel. Give me more. Depending on the source. So on a coal plant, a natural gas plant, there may be more capacity in that generator that's running, and so they'll generate more. Yes. MISO may say, hey, we've got more load than we think, generator turn on. More and more water. Okay. So that on a big scale, that's how that works. On the other side, if it's too much, it'll go fast. It'll overspeed. And so they'll start cutting back. Okay. And those are signals to generators to make changes. What will make the grid more difficult to manage and run is now when most of your generators don't have that throttle. A coal plant, a gas plant, and mostly it's automatic, but it has a throttle, I can give it more. If I have a solar plant, I can't. And if it's cloudy and it wasn't supposed to be, and that goes away, where does that other generation come from? That's a lot of the challenge. Just 1 second. That's a lot of the challenges we're going to run into going forward. That's where the push to add batteries. The other thing I didn't mention in the presentation is another one of the laws that was passed is in Michigan, we have a mandate to have 2.5 gigawatts of batteries on our system by 2030. And every utility will have a share. And how they do that is they say, utility, what is your load compared to the state? That's so much percentage. You need to put so many batteries on the system. Because we feel we need those to handle that, to make the grid operate. So for Alpena Power, we'll have roughly 6 megawatts of batteries we'll have to put on the system. That's a lot of batteries. But that's one of the ways they're going to try to technically attack those issues. Any question over here?
State, they would have like brownouts, and I could sign up, and I did, to allow the power company to take electricity. So I might not have air conditioning in the afternoon, it would be like intermittent. So I did all my laundry at night.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. That's something that's still up here though.
We don't have tariffs on a residential scale for that. We have tariffs on an industrial scale. So we have, with some large industries around here, we have the ability to curtail them in emergency, in a shortage situation. We've never had, other utilities in the state have that. You could argue the success of those programs, people could. We have not had a large interest in them. They are, and to be honest with you, they're difficult to manage. They can be costly because of the infrastructure needed. There's different ways to do that. I could just say, hey, everybody lower raise your thermostat on your AC in the summer. If I don't have control of it, are people really going to do it? Some people will, some people won't. There's programs like that in the country where then customers had the ability to override it. So I could get a signal and it could say, the utility could actually go, through their system and into my house and change my thermostat or stop my dryer from running or being able to run. So it gets into how, people's choice and how you want to manage that. There's an increased focus on that because of the challenges with keeping the grid balanced. And what other levers can you pull? Then instead of pulling the lever to increase generation, can I pull a lever to reduce demand? And different people have different opinions on, can you do that or not? I wouldn't try to do that at my dad's house. I think he'd come after me. But
from Denver, you know, my friends out there said that they are just since January. Where if you use electricity during the day, it costs more, but if you use it in the evening, it's, I wouldn't say substantially cheaper, but quite a bit cheaper. So they're doing only their dryer at night, their washer at night. They're really cutting back at anything that they're using during the day that uses power. Is that something that's being thought of up here, or?
We have those kind of programs. So basically any larger commercial to industrial operates under that kind of tariff, where the price is different we call it on peak, during the day when price is more expensive versus at night when it may be cheaper. So they have varying rates. From a residential customer, if you have an EV or electric heat, you can apply for that and have that apply for that. So if I charge my EV at night, it'd be significantly cheaper than if I charge it during the day. To a factor of almost double. It's almost double during the day versus at night. Now, that goes back to the model of what does electric demand look like during the day. Typically night is lowest. Historically, night has been lowest. Everybody wakes up in the morning, they start turning things on, demand goes up. It's high during the afternoon, evening it starts to drop off, and it's kind of just a cycle like that. What is happening with the addition of all this renewable generation, specifically solar, is changing that curve. Where during midday, and this is happening in California now, because of the amount of solar and behind the meter solar they have, where actual demand, net demand during the day is the lowest. It may even go negative because of the amount of solar out there when the sun is on, or the sun is out, and you get the most generation out of that. So it's changing those how those models work. Other ways utilities are doing it is they're saying, well, I'll just give you real-time pricing. And by real-time pricing, the MISO who runs those markets, those prices update every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, power prices change. It responds to those signals. So on a certain day, it may be low, it may be high, depending on how much generation is out there. So there's more things out there to help minimize the impact of that, help customers save money. But what a lot of it requires is customers get more involved in their energy usage. To understand, hey, when do I, am I going to run my dishwasher after dinner, or am I going to get hit 4-hour delay and have it run during the night? Or am I going to do my laundry, when late at night or in the morning or some other time, run my dryer at a different time? It's that convenience, and that's customer's choice when they want to do that. These programs are all voluntary. They're all voluntary at this point. I'll say at this point, who knows what comes down the line later on. I think there's another question over here. Okay, so on Long Rapids Road, that is Alpena Power Company's main interconnection to the larger scale grid. Okay, so that is owned by a company called ITC. So they own the transmission system in our region of the state. So the lines you see going up US 23 to Rogers City, there's the line that goes to the west over towards Gaylord, those are owned by ITC. They handle the transmission system. That is where Alpena Power's interconnection is to that grid. So all of our assets, like these lines that are right out here in Johnson Street, they go through our system, they all end up, their source is that substation on 4 Mile.
Distribution.
It is, yes, it's where the bulk electric system grid connects to Alpena Power. So there's multiple lines that come in there and then can go out of there on the transmission system. And then there's 3 lines that come out of that sub and connect to Alpena Power. Correct. So from those lines, one goes up to Rogers City and on to Sheboygan. One goes west to Gaylord, and the other one goes south to Bay City. That's kind of where the grid can, but that's where Alpena Power interconnects. That was built there It replaced the substation that was near the dam that was built in the 50s. Yeah, right near the 4 Mile Dam. Okay, the sub right by the dam is jointly owned by Alpena Power and ITC. It's actually split by a fence. ITC's half was rebuilt and replaced with that sub. It's much larger. It seems much larger. It essentially does the same function, but it's up to today's standards for spacing and safety and things like that. The ability to take equipment out of service. They are built to a much higher standard today than, I'll give you an example. You've probably seen these around here. We replace a lot of old wood poles with seems like enormous steel structures. Okay? Part of that is to handle things like that. Okay? It's much easier to knock down a wood pole held up by some wires than it is a 4-foot diameter steel structure. So a lot of those upgrades are for those reasons. To handle weather, but also handle those kinds of things. It does happen. It does happen, unfortunately.
Sidebar. Who's the owner of Alpena Power now?
Alpena Power is owned by, most of it is the Fletcher family and relatives.
Succession plan?
There is. There is. I can't get into the details of it, but yes, we are set up to continue on.
Since 1970, it's been good, dependable, and more reasonable than anywhere else in the state of Wyoming.
I appreciate that. I would too. I would too. Yes, we've been around since 1881. And actually, we're one of the oldest utilities anywhere. We're older than consumers. We're older than DTE. We've been around since people first started messing around with this stuff.
Well, you're giving us a lot of information. It's really been something you can quite little bit understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for having me. I know it's a complex topic, but it's becoming, this is my opinion, for a very long time, people turned on their light switch and they didn't really think about it a lot. And things just kind of operated. But things are changing. There's more change going on now than probably in the last 80 or 90 years when electricity really kind of went everywhere. There's more investment going on. There's a lot of change happening. And it's going to involve people understanding it a little bit, understanding a little bit more. Because we're going to need to. There's going to be more programs like demand response and do I want to participate this or not? How do I manage my energy use? There's going to be ways to for customers to save money by being more proactive with that stuff. And understanding it more. In my opinion, I probably shouldn't say this on the recording, but with our legislators understood it a little bit more, but it is what it is. So, any other questions for me? Yes.
Our power goes out here, it's out for 2 or 3 hours at the most. My son lives in the Benton area, they might lose it for a week. That generator hooked up to the main artery going into the house, and, you guys, you own the power lines, transmission, the local stuff, and take excellent care of it. And it shows.
I appreciate that. And we take a lot of pride in that. We're also in a small community, and I've been out those storms helping to, working on helping to restore, because it's our customer, we all know our customers, and most people know who works for Alpena Power Company. And so we take a lot of pride in that. And it's how we design the system, how we operate it, and the work ethic that a lot of those guys have. I mean, I've been out there, I've missed Christmas working, because the power is out, but that's what we do. But I appreciate it. It's nice to hear those comments. Thank you. Anything else for me? Thank you.